I'm Michael Fairchild, and I'm really excited to introduce this topic to you. So let's dive in. All right, so what is accessibility behavior informed development anyway? Well, it is an agile software development process. It is a specialized version of behavior-driven development, also known as BDD. And similar to behavior-driven development, it facilitates collaborative planning for accessibility with cross-functional team members. I'll explain what all of this really means in the rest of the talk here, but this is just accessibility behavior informed development at a very high level. The key here is that it results in a set of accessibility acceptance criteria, also known as AC, and it could also result in a potentially revised design that is now more accessible. So in order to really talk about what this is, we kind of have to talk about how it started, why it's important, right? How it got to be in the first place. So let's do that. So there was a company that was really focused on accessibility. They realized that, okay, yes, we need to focus on accessibility, and we have a lot of stuff that we have already made, and we need to make it accessible. So in that situation, the common reaction is to, okay, let's do an assessment and then remediate the software so that it is accessible. The client quickly realized that this is not very sustainable, because the assessment and remediation has to happen very late in the development process. It has to happen after the design is made, after the code is written. Usually it happens after the software is already deployed and released. And because this happens very late in the process, we end up with a lot of defects that we have to take back to the development team, possibly even to the designers, to get everything fixed. And that can be very frustrating for teams, be very frustrating for the stakeholders, and most importantly, it's very frustrating for the end users. And this doesn't fix the process, right? This is just a Band-Aid that we sometimes use at the end of the process to fix accessibility, but it doesn't integrate accessibility into any part of the process that happens before the code is built. So the client realized that, okay, this is an okay solution for where we're at right now, but for everything else that we build into the future, we want to make sure that that content is going to be accessible from the start. We don't want to have to get a huge list of defects at release after an audit and go back and spend a long time fixing those problems, right? So the client wanted to teach their development teams to learn to fish for themselves. And what we mean by that is that they wanted their teams to be able to create accessible software from the start, at least mostly accessible software from the start, to mitigate the number of defects they found later in the process, so that they could release higher quality code that is more accessible, more enjoyable to end users from the start. So this kind of speaks to accessibility coaching. I'm an accessibility coach, and what I do as an accessibility coach is I join a team with the goal of helping them to change their skill, their will, and their process to account for accessibility as early and as efficiently as possible. So shift accessibility as far left in the development process as possible, help them develop their skills in order to deliver accessible products in a technical way, and also for like integrate accessibility into their development process. So it's thought about at every step along the way. And it becomes a very intentional part of the process. And so I joined this client, and they wanted to try to achieve this goal. And they did, they tried several tactics to do that. Some of which I was there for, some of which I was not there for. But I wanted to give you some context for what was tried in order to help you understand what came before accessibility behavior informed development and the shortcomings that this new process tries to address. And so just a kind of a disclaimer and a note about the following approaches. Each of the following approaches has their own pros and cons, and I'm going to be focusing a lot on the negatives of these approaches or techniques. But I don't want you to get hung up on those, and I don't want your takeaway to be that I should never, ever use any of these approaches. They all can be very valid and very useful. They could be what you need. It just depends on your situation. And in order for, just like any tool that anyone uses, we kind of have to understand what it's good at, what it's not good at in order to use it well. So checklists is a very common approach to trying to integrate accessibility further left in the development process. But it does come with some negatives, some things that make it difficult, maybe not optimal. And it definitely wasn't optimal for the client in their situation. So some of the problems that checklists have are that they usually happen late in the process. In order for us to test a code, like in order for us to test code, that code has to be written, right? In order for us to test a design against a checklist, that design has to have already been made, right? So we're still not shifting as far left as we could be. Additionally, the checkpoints that are found on checklists are going to be very diverse and cover situations that maybe don't appear in a given design or page, right? For example, there might not be any videos, there might not be any audio, there might not be any dynamic content. It could just be a static page, right? So not all the checkpoints in the list are going to be relevant, and that can be distracting, and it could take time to sift through, okay, what's relevant, what's not. Additionally, the rules are going to be very abstract. They have to be written to apply to many different scenarios, many different situations. And that can be good in a lot of ways, but it's also it can be very difficult to interpret what those abstract rules mean and apply them to specific scenarios. And that can lead to disagreement, misunderstandings, assumptions, and those disagreements, misunderstandings, and assumptions then lead to rework down the road, or they lead to things not actually becoming accessible like we thought they would. So there's also the definition of done. The definition of done is something that is often found in an agile context. Agile teams often get together and write down what they think the definition of done should be. And then they put it in their documentation. And the idea is that in order for any given user story to be considered completely done, everything in the list of definition of done needs to be met. And if it's not met, that it's not really done. The problem here is that the definition of done itself is often kind of hidden and forgotten. It's not usually front and center. In my experience, a lot of crews tend to forget about it or not reference it for every story. Becomes something of an artifact. And the rules that are in the definition of done are very abstract. They're not always going to be relevant. They have the same problems as a checklist because the definition of done is a general piece of documentation. It's not specific to a given story or design or thing that you're trying to build, right? So we have all the same problems as checklists that I just described. Design annotations are also fantastic, and they can do a really good job of moving accessibility forward and making it clear what the intentions were for a given design when it comes to accessibility. And in this example, I have a login form with an error message. So at the top of the login form, there's a heading that says login. Then there's an error message that says the error, the credentials that you entered were not recognized. Please try again. Then there's an email address input, and then there's a password input and a login button. For each of the distinct elements in this design, there's also an annotation attached to it. So for example, for the login heading, there's an annotation that says that it should be at H1 or heading level 1. Next to the red X icon, next to the error message, there's an annotation that says it's a decorative image. Next to the error text, the heading for the error message, there's an annotation that says that it's an H2. For the email address, the annotation is name should be email address, role equals text box. For password, the name is password, the role is text box. For the login button, the name is login and the role is button, right? So this does a lot to convey to whoever's developing the design, what the expectations are and what the designer was thinking when they created the design as it pertains to accessibility. There are some problems with this approach, or there can be some problems with this approach. The first of which is that the person that's making these annotations, which is often going to be the designer, they need to be experts in many fields. They need to be experts in design, but also in accessibility. You could have a subject matter expert join in for accessibility and do these annotations themselves, but then they would, that's an extra cost, and it's not always going to be very efficient. The other important aspect of this that could be considered a problem is that these annotations don't really describe the user experience. Often they describe more of the code and what the code expectations are from an accessibility perspective, rather than how they affect the experience for people with various disabilities, right? That can make it difficult to understand why it's important. It could, developers who see this might think, well, that's just what they think. That's just what the designer thinks this should be coded as. I know better. I'm going to do it my way. It doesn't really tell them why they need to be doing it the way it was suggested, right? There's also usually very little collaboration between whoever is doing the annotations and the rest of the development team, and this can lead to arguments. It can lead to friction. It can lead to issues down the road where whoever's building the thing or testing the thing might not agree with the annotations, or they might find it difficult to actually achieve what the annotations are trying to say from a technical perspective. And they might think of a better way or a more efficient way to approach it, but the annotations are already there, and it's hard to have that conversation at this point. So again, design annotations good, or they're really good in some situations, but there are some gaps that we need to acknowledge. Automation, I think, is also a fundamental part of accessibility. And we need to be able to leverage automation like Axe Dev tools to test our products and reduce the chances of regressions and improve efficiency of testing and all that sort of stuff. But there are also some gaps here. It's not the full answer. We shouldn't just be doing automation by itself. So we need to acknowledge it for what it is. One problem here is that code needs to be written first. In order to test something, it has to be, testable, and the code needs to be written. So that speaks to not being shifted further left, right? You might discover something here that requires a design change, so you end up having to step back and talk to the designers and get the design changed, which is not going to be efficient or desirable. There's automation that can only test part of WCAG. It's not going to be a comprehensive test for WCAG. We still need to do automated testing on top of it. And automation is configured by humans. It's possible for humans to let things like not configure it well. Like they might only test it on the initial page, might only test a page with the initial page state. They might forget to, if there's an accordion on the page, they might forget to expand every section of the accordion so we can test the content within each part of the accordion too. So it is possible to miss content that should be tested with this sort of automation. Education is also very important. Without education, it's going to be hard to build the skills that we need in order to carry out accessible development effectively. But there are also some, it's not the full answer. There are some gaps here. One gap is that participants only retain so much from trainings. If you think back to when you were in high school, do you remember everything in every single one of your classes? Right? That's a lot to remember, and you're just going to forget some of it. There's scheduling conflicts. So if we're doing an in-person training, and like chances are someone's going to be sick that day on the development team, or someone's going to have a scheduling conflict or something like that. And so not everyone is going to be able to attend, and there will be gaps in knowledge on your team because not everyone could attend that day. It's also difficult to practice what you learned if there's no process to prompt you to practice it, right? And it's going to be hard to retain what you learned if you don't practice it. So education is definitely a fundamental aspect of getting accessibility right, but it's not the entire answer. So we tried a lot of these different approaches, and we started to see, none of these are really working well in terms of making software development sustainable and turning out code from the start with very few accessibility defects. So we we're trying to think, okay, what is working well? The teams that we're working with, they were developing good products by other measures other than accessibility. So what process were they following to do that development, right? So what process does the team follow now that we can just kind of piggyback off of and learn from, right? So this is a very simplified version of their development process, very simplified overview of their process. First, they'd get a plan together, decide they need a certain feature. Stakeholders, designers, product owners would get together, collaborate on working through a design. That design would be created to be passed off to the development team. Development team would write some stories to implement that design. They'd develop it, they'd test it, they'd accept it. Eventually they'd release it, and they'd repeat the whole process, right? So the key here is story writing. And this is something that we kind of overlooked at first. But when we dove into the story writing bit, we kind of realized there's some very important stuff here that we could leverage for accessibility. So let's dive into that story writing part. So the story writing process kind of flows like this. Before we even get to the story writing, what's going to happen is that the designers, content writers, product owners, legal, other stakeholders, they all get together, they collaborate on working through a design, getting that design finalized, and then it's passed off to the development team. When the development team gets it, there's going to be someone on the team, usually a business system analyst, but it could be anyone. So there's this analyst who takes that design and they work with the team to translate it into a bunch of stories with acceptance criteria. The process that they use to create these stories and acceptance criteria is very much collaboration with cross-functional team members, and so they work with everyone on the team to get feedback, to collaborate with them, to try to figure out and suss out like what the requirements really are. They try to really write the requirements well before they actually start development. And so once they have all these stories with acceptance criteria, they then hand it off to the rest of the development team, where they develop to those acceptance criteria. They test those acceptance criteria. The product owner accepts the story or rejects it, right? And then they get to release. So what we saw play out there was essentially behavior-driven development. So behavior-driven development, again, it's an agile process that's pretty common, pretty commonly used in the development world. The problem it tries to solve is that requirements are often abstract and full of assumptions. It's hard for people to understand them. They're kind of in the clouds and vague, right? This leads to the development team not having a shared understanding of what those requirements really mean. So they don't really code the right thing. They code it wrong. They get a few things wrong. The stakeholder comes back and says, no, that's not what I meant. Let's try again. That leads to the product being delivered late, and that leads to a higher cost, right? So that's the problem it tries to solve. The solution that behavior-driven development brings to the table is conversations between stakeholders, cross-functional team members, to discover and really think through the system behavior. And then they write down that behavior, what those expectations are, what those requirements are, as concrete examples in a plain, easy to read human language that we often refer to as scenarios and acceptance criteria. And these scenarios and their acceptance criteria are written in such a way that they're not only human readable and plain language, but they're also testable, machine readable, and can live as an executable specification in the software's test suite, which gets run every time like there's a pull request or a code change, just to make sure that there were no regressions. So it's very powerful, and it gets everyone involved. It gets testers, developers involved. It gets stakeholders involved, and gets everyone working on the same page. So let's take a look at one of these acceptance criteria. So again, we have that same login form with an error message that I referenced earlier. This is the first AC in a story that we might have to implement this design. The scenario here is a user sees an error message when they enter incorrect credentials while trying to log in. So given that I am on the login page and I entered my username and password incorrectly. When I click login, then I see an error message displayed above the form. That is one example of an acceptance criteria you might see in a story. And kind of the structure you just saw, that structure is with the given, when, then keywords. That is something known as the gherkin format. It's gherkin is a format that comes from the Cucumber testing tool. And Cucumber is a way that is a tool that allows developers or testers to automate and programmatically consume these acceptance criteria to automate them later as part of the test suite. But here's a breakdown of what those keywords mean. So scenario, this is kind of the concrete example, is a summary of the desired behavior. The scenario contains the acceptance criteria, and the acceptance criteria follow a given, when, then, like syntax. So given, that keyword means that it describes any preconditions and context. It prepares the test environment, right? Gets everything in place for us to be able to actually execute our test. The when keyword, the when step, if you will, it describes the action that is being tested. So once you have everything set up, this is what you need to do to trigger the test, like the action that we're going to test. And then the then step describes the expected outcomes of what is expected to happen after we trigger the test in the when step, if that makes sense. So writing acceptance criteria in this path, it allows this human readable requirement to be machine consumable, but it also provides a mental structure for everyone involved to really think through how each requirement will play out in practice. And it makes the requirement itself inherently testable, which lends itself to better quality requirements. So who uses these acceptance criteria? The entire team uses them, and they use them together in certain ways, and they use them separately in certain ways. So together, they use them to accurately point and estimate stories, to come to a shared agreement as to what the requirement really is, and a shared understanding of what the requirement really is. The analyst uses these acceptance criteria and this behavior-driven development process to really craft quality acceptance criteria, make sure everyone's on the same page. And the developers use them to know what needs to be coded and how to test it themselves. The testers use them to know what to test and how. And the product owners then use them to help accept stories and look for evidence that the requirements were actually met. So let's dive into accessibility behavior informed development now that we've discussed behavior-driven development and kind of what came before accessibility behavior-driven development. So what is accessibility behavior informed development? This is kind of the process that is driven by accessibility behavior informed development. So we have our concrete examples of the UI. These usually exist as a high fidelity design. That design is then handed off to the analyst. The analyst works with the rest of the team to do some collaborative planning around the design. What does that mean? What does that collaborative planning look like in practice? It means that they'll use cross-functional conversations to review the design and actually write stories and include accessibility-focused acceptance criteria. And they'll think through the assistive technology experience of those designs and write them as acceptance criteria. The result is a potentially revised design. So as part of this, they're reviewing the design for accessibility. And that might mean that they find some problems with the design. That's okay. That's good. Then they go back to the designer. They bring this issue to the designer. They get it revised. And then they end up with stories with accessibility focused acceptance criteria, also written in the gherkin format. So one way to facilitate the collaborative planning bit with the rest of the team is something that I like to call the accessibility amigos meeting. In behavior-driven development, you often find a pre-refinement or a three amigos meeting. They're kind of the same concept, just different words. In those meetings, you often get the analyst, a developer, a tester, and sometimes a product owner in the same room. That subset of team members then works to craft a draft of acceptance criteria that the crew then reviews later in a wider refinement session where everyone gets together and they review everything that was drafted, and they make changes to it, or they point to stories at that point or something like that. The pre-refinement or three amigos meeting, it lets other team members focus on their sprint activities and get their work done, while only having a few team members dive into the first drafts of really working through the acceptance criteria. So we can leverage either those same meetings or a similar meeting that I like to call the accessibility amigos meeting to have similar conversations around accessibility. And in these meetings, we might have people like the designer, the analyst, the developer, the tester, and the product owner all in the same room, reviewing that design, thinking through the assistive technology experience of that design, writing out the requirements and that experience really as acceptance criteria that are focused on accessibility. And the key here is that there's no one single accessibility expert on the crew. Instead, all of that knowledge that a single accessibility expert would have is divided amongst the crew in their different roles, right? So developer is really good at accessibility as it pertains to development. The tester is really good at accessibility as it pertains to testing. The designer is really good at accessibility as it pertains to designing, right? And that then sort of frees up the team to focus on their own domains, but the collaborative planning and conversation bit of this gets everyone together and discussing how we need to implement the design in an accessible way that accounts for all of their different perspectives and domains of knowledge, right? So very powerful. So let's go through a quick example of how this might play out. So we have, for our input, we have a design. In this design, it's that same login screen we've been looking at. But in this example of the design, there's a textual contrast failure within the error message. The background of the error message against the text foreground doesn't meet minimal WCAG contrast requirements. So that's the design the team is going to start to bring through the accessibility behavior informed development process. And during that process, they're going to use cross-functional conversations to review that design and start to craft accessibility AC. In order to facilitate that and those conversations, they might lean on checklists. This is a good time to use checklists before code is ever written. They might lean on education, things they have learned in the past. They might lean on documentation. For example, they might reference a component library with accessibility guidance for various components. They might just also lean on past experience. As you get more, as you work more and more with, say, like a screen reader or something like that, the more experienced you're going to be. And you're going to be able to lean on that experience and bring that experience to the table to help improve and write better requirements into the future, right? So the output of this process is then a revised design. The design itself documents the visual experience. It also documents the visual requirements as it pertains to accessibility, such as this color is used here or this color is used there. These are the labels for these different form fields and stuff like that. In this example, the development team reviewed the design. They found that color contrast problem. They brought it back to the designer, and they ended up with a new design where that fixes that color contrast problem, right? So it could also result in a revised design. In the output from this process, they also get some accessibility AC, which documents the assistive technology experience, such as the screen reader user experience or the sighted keyboard user experience. So here are some examples of what those accessibility AC might look like. So we have a scenario here. A sighted keyboard only user with a motor disability is brought to an error message after trying to submit a login form with incorrect credentials. Given I am a sighted keyboard only user with a motor disability and I am on the login page and I entered my username and password incorrectly, when I activate the login button, then my keyboard focus is brought to the error that is displayed above the form, and I can visually see where my keyboard focus is on the page. So again, we're still discussing that login form that we've been stepping through this entire process so far. Another example of an accessibility AC would be scenario: a blind screen reader user is not made aware of decorative images. Given I am a blind screen reader user and I am on the login page and the error message about incorrect credentials is displayed, when I navigate past the error icon, then the error icon is not conveyed, right? So this style of writing accessibility requirements, it describes the user experience, it describes the assistive technology user experience, which can really help to clarify why it's important, how it affects the users. It can drive awareness to accessibility throughout the crew and stakeholders. Those are some really powerful things to be able to do in a story itself. And it's also, it describes why it's important. It describes what's expected, but it also describes how to test it. And that's also very, very important and powerful. So in an ideal world, we'd be able to automate all of these accessibility AC, and they could live in we could script them with Cucumber, and they could live in your test suite in much the same way that all the other acceptance criteria could be scripted. But we can't do that for all of these yet. We could test a lot of the keyboard behaviors. There are definitely tools out there that allow us to test a lot of these keyboard behaviors. But when it comes to screen reader testing, there's not really like a screen reader driver out there right now that's enterprise ready, driven by standards, and well maintained. We're starting to get, the industry is starting to move in this direction. People are getting more and more interested in the concept of the screen reader driver. And I'm really excited about that future and being able to automate accessibility AC with a screen reader. I think that's fantastic, and very powerful to be able to do an end-to-end test by automating an actual screen reader to ensure that that actual screen reader user experience is good and meets the requirements, right? We could also test with screen reader APIs or accessibility trees and browsers. But again, if we test at at those different layers of the development stack, we're not really testing end to end. We're testing maybe end to 3/4 or something like that. It's not perfect, and they all these ways to test the screen reader experience kind of come with their own pros and cons. And I could talk about this for hours, so I'll just kind of stop. But there is definitely power and value in integrating accessibility AC into your CI/CD process, and I think that's worth exploring. So what's left? We still need to do manual audits. We're humans. Humans are the people writing these requirements, and things will fall through the cracks. So we need to do audits to find what fell through the cracks, and intelligent guided testing could be a good way to at least start that. We need to be doing user research and get end user feedback. We need to include people with disabilities in that research and that feedback, because we need to really try to answer this question: how do we make the experience more delightful for people with disabilities? We also need to lean on education and training. How do we make sure that teams gain the skill and will needed to make accessible software? And education and training can do a lot to address those concerns. So how do we make accessibility behavior informed development more scalable and efficient? I'd say lean on an accessible design system and component library. If you have that, then you can build something that I call an accessibility AC library. An accessibility AC library could either be integrated into your component library, your design system, or just a standalone site. And what it would do is it would guide a business system analyst or whoever's writing these stories on the crew through selecting the appropriate set of accessibility AC for a given component or pattern, and allow them to easily copy paste that templatized accessibility AC into a story. At that point, it'd be trivial to fill in the blanks and clean things up, and it would greatly improve the time it takes to write quality acceptance criteria and make the experience more consistent and standard. And we also need to lean on automation to automate as much as possible. Anytime we lean on automation, we're going to leverage efficiencies. So definitely lean on automation wherever we can. If we have an accessibility AC library, we can use a process called AIMS to really speed things up for whoever's writing these stories. The AIMS process flows like this. Step one, assess the design for accessibility, ask questions, and remove assumptions. So again, that could be a collaboration between different team members. Step two would be to identify and inventory patterns used in the designs, components used in the designs, right? Step three would be to map those patterns and components to AC using guidance from the AC library. You would follow the guidance, essentially a bunch of if-then statements, and then you would select the appropriate AC, put them into your story, and fill in the blanks, right? And step four is to solve for any remaining gaps, such as open questions or remaining or missing acceptance criteria. Maybe there's a component that showed up in that design that you haven't seen before. Maybe there's a novel component there that you need to build from scratch. You can handle those things by leaning back on your team and on the broader accessibility behavior informed development process. So the next steps here are to try to apply accessibility behavior informed development to something in your next sprint. Just experiment with it. You could try to create an accessible design system and component library if you don't already have that. I would suggest creating an accessibility AC library. You could also leverage Deque's accessibility coaching program. We have resources and coaches to help you get up to speed with this process faster and more effectively. And I want to encourage you to go to a11ybid.com. That is going to take you to a Deque blog post that describes this process in depth, so you can reference it again in the future, and it goes into some different examples than what I went into today. So you might be able to learn some things that I didn't cover in this talk. Yeah, so now that you know that this process exists, I hope you use it, and I hope you find it valuable. And I'm looking forward to it being used more and more often. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was excellent. Wonderful stuff. We have a little bit of limited time here for Q&A, so I want to just go ahead and jump right into it. The first big question that the audience has been asking is, what is the role of a UI designer in defining accessibility features in a web development process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd say the role of a UI designer is to participate in just the collaborative aspect of this whole process. And you can certainly even kick it off yourself as a designer by leaning on practices that designers often lean on to document accessibility in designs, such as using annotations and stuff like that, in order to start the conversations with the team, help them understand your intent, and approach that collaborative process with the rest of the team.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, there were a few other questions pretty similar along the same lines. Do you know of any standardized or templated accessibility acceptance criteria?
Yeah, it's a really good question too. We don't have any published right now, so I can't really share any specifically, but we usually try to use two what we call universal accessibility acceptance criteria in every story. Those two are going to be one that's focused on just testing with Axe dev tools, and that can help to speed up the process and cover things that might have fallen through the cracks of planning. And the other one is just a general keyboard user experience AC that covers like general cases, and it just makes sure that the page is generally accessible with keyboard AC, but it doesn't get into like specific keyboard expectations for that might be a bit unusual for, say, like a kind of thinking like a ARIA-based grid or maybe tab panel or something like that. So you might need more specific accessibility AC for those situations to cover that more specific keyboard experience. Good question, though. Yep.
Yeah, really good question. We had a handful of similar questions like that. All right, last one that we have here. Do you have a preference for a component library?
Do I have a preference for a component library? The best component library is the one that you use that meets your needs, but is also accessible. Unfortunately, I don't think there's very many really good component libraries out there that are accessible and fit your needs. So chances are you're going to have to find something that fits your needs and work to make it accessible. And that's going to be a little bit of work up front, but it's going to pay off down the road.
Absolutely. Well, Michael, it has been absolutely wonderful having you. Thank you so much. And everyone in the audience, really appreciate you joining. Shout out to our ASL interpreters, Whitney and Beth. We do appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.